Greetings, friends. Welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our ongoing series of interviews with noted writers. And I have a most noted writer as my guest today. Before I introduce him, let me introduce myself. My name is Joe Chuman. I'm a part-time leader at the New York Society for Ethical Culture and recently retired as a professor of human rights at Columbia University, teaching in the graduate school to some very talented students. My guest today is Joshua Leifer. Let me say a few things about him. Joshua is young but very accomplished. He's a journalist, editor, and translator. His writings have been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, Haaretz, and The Nation, among other periodicals. He's worked as an editor for Jewish Currents and has been on the editorial board of Dissent magazine. Joshua is currently pursuing his PhD at Yale, studying the history of modern moral and social thought. It's my pleasure and privilege to be interviewing Joshua today on his recent book, published, in fact, just this year. It's entitled Tablet Shattered, the End of the American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. Joshua, welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be in conversation with you.
Okay, thanks. Let me start off. As I mentioned to you before we went on the air, I think this is just a phenomenal, profoundly well-researched book and elegantly written from my point of view. I was just personally engrossed in it. It's both a study of the state and perhaps the destiny of the American Jewish community, as well as a book that is deeply and I think honestly personal. It's a type of memoir, perhaps we might even say at some points a cri de coeur. So I'd like to begin, if I may, Joshua, with the personal. Can you tell us about your background, which includes, as you indicate and elaborate in the book, the background of your family, your immersion in Judaism, and what moved you, inspired you, or perhaps even pressured you to write this book?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question. I mean, the book picks up with my great grandmother Bessie, who was born in a shtetl called Yuban, which was outside of a larger town called Slutskin, which is now Belarus. And she, of course, came from a traditionally Orthodox background. And her story, which is one that the book charts, takes her, this is a very familiar American Jewish story, and takes her from the shtetl to the Lower East Side, and then eventually to the Bronx, where my grandmother was born. My grandmother, or as Bubby as we called her, grew up in the Bronx and rebelled in a sense against her religious upbringing and became a Yiddish secularist and was very involved in the Arbiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle. She met my grandfather at their sleepaway camp and is buried in their cemetery plot. And my father grew up in New Rochelle, the child of these Yiddish secularists who found themselves conservative Jews in the suburbs, because how else were you going to be Jewish if you were not going to belong to a formal synagogue in some sense? And fast forward to my own background. I mean, I was raised in Bergen County in northern New Jersey, and attended day school for the first 8 years of my education, a conservative Jewish day school. This school was kind of on the, you could say, like on the more observant end of the conservative movement, but I think much more important than the religious in the sense of like religious practical education was that it was a very Zionist education. It was an education in which the religious was inflected through Israel, and so every morning we said the Pledge of Allegiance, and sang Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, and then prayed the morning prayers of Shacharit. So, and we spoke in Hebrew half the day, and from there I kind of grew up in a very in a community that was very, very supportive of Israel, where Israel played a central role. And in some sense, the book, if there's a drama or to the book, it's a grappling with with the question of what it means to have grown up with a Jewish identity that's so Israel-centric at a time when, for a lot of people, Israel isn't really a viable center of their Jewish identities anymore. And so even though it's history, it's also memoir, it's also reportage, and there's a whole section as well about lots of different groups and people who are trying to make sense of their Jewish identities in this very complicated time.
Okay, very good. Let's get into the substance of the book. Your analysis leads you to the conclusion, your extensive analysis leads you to the conclusion that the American Jewish community is crackling and crumbling. It's essentially splintering, dissipating. And in that sense, the book is, I have to sort of give away the spoiler, the book in effect is a pessimistic book about the Jewish condition and the Jewish future. But that comes out of a very thick analysis of what's happening in the Jewish community. Your thesis is predicated on the notion that American Judaism has been sustained or built around three pillars that you identify. One of them is Americanism. A second is a commitment to Zionism. And a third is the American Jewish, for the most part, identification with liberalism. And as the American Jewish immigrant community ascended in the 20th century, these, we could argue, created a very robust community in America. But those three pillars, in some sense, are American Judaism's unraveling. Could you talk about each of those pillars, on which American Judaism has identified itself, built itself, Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism? Can you develop that for us, please?
Of course. Yeah. So the central argument of the book is that there was a ideological consensus about what it meant to be an American Jew that consolidated roughly after World War II, and that has begun to disintegrate in our day. And like you said, those pillars are Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism. By Americanism, I mean a certain kind of American Jewish exceptionalism. It's the idea that America is an exceptionally good country, and that fact is ratified by the Jewish experience in America. I mean, you hear this a lot. One example that I use in the book is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's confirmation hearing, where she repeats a familiar joke, which is, what's the difference between a garment worker and a Supreme Court justice? And the answer is 1 generation. And for her, that's kind of the magic of America. I mean, Americanism for American Jews is also bolstered later in the second half of the century by America's support for Israel, and also the comparison between America and other places where Jews live, like, say, the Soviet Union, where Jews were much less free. The middle pillar, Zionism, is actually, like, by Zionism in the book, I don't mean this, the thing that everyone's debating about, one state, two state. I actually mean the idea that Israel, there are two components here. One is the idea that Israel is a moral exemplar and kind of encapsulates American Jewish values in miniature. And the other is that Israel is the culmination of all of Jewish history, beginning from biblical times to the present, that it all had to culminate in this thing. And then by liberalism, I actually don't mean political liberalism, but I mean religious liberalism. In other words, an approach to religion that's focused on the individual as opposed to the group, a way of interacting with observance that's based on individual choice rather than, say, the traditional conception of, like, divine obligation, commandment, mitzvah. And then also a way of thinking about how to do religion that's kind of pluralist or maybe even relativist. In other words, American Jews don't really like to tell people how they should practice their Judaism. They certainly don't like being told how to practice their Judaism. But it also makes it hard for, say, Jewish parents to tell their children it's maybe better to live a Jewish life than, say, other kinds of life options on the marketplace of lifestyles in, capitalist America. And so my argument is that these three pillars, in some sense, sustained American Judaism until basically the present. I mean, one way we can see this is that if American Jewish identity is tied to a particularly exceptionalist idea of America. Well, what happens when people start to think that America isn't so great after all? And you have, I think, over the last half decade or so, we've seen the proliferation of scholarship and public commentary about America's original sin of slavery and systemic racism, and and certainly the two Trump elections have done a great deal to sully that kind of optimistic belief in America. Likewise, Zionism has become probably the greatest source of division in Jewish life. And you would be hard pressed to find a room of Jews where everyone could agree that Israel is a moral exemplar. I mean, reality speaks for itself in that sense. But also liberalism that crumbled, not so much because people stopped believing in it, but that it made it very hard to sustain community over the long term. And I think that this has led to a lot of the polarization and splintering and disintegration, as you mentioned. But as I write in the book, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. It certainly means we won't be going back to the period of mid-century consensus, but there might be a lot of other things that that happen instead.
Well, what comes to mind, I think I'm older than you. In fact, Joshua, I may be twice your age. And I see myself as being a product of what we might call the afterglow of the American Jewish immigrant experience. You mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg and one generation leading to the Supreme Court. I'm not going to be a Supreme Court justice, but I sometimes marvel talking about Americanism and the gift of America for Jews and how it has been exceptional in Jewish history, Jewish flourishing, and so on. Maybe the only thing that might have vestiges of that notion, you have to go back to medieval Spain, maybe, and maybe Germany at some point. The Jews love Germany, but America has given Jews freedom and opportunity like no other place. When I think of my own background, my own father was born in 1903 in Ukraine in poverty into a condition which I call folk orthodoxy. You don't call it that, right, but you reference that phenomenon among European Jewish immigrants. He had absolutely no education whatsoever, except for 3 years of cheder, that is Jewish, education, for only 3 years. That was his sole education. And here his son, namely myself, has a PhD from an Ivy League university. Right? It's pretty
remarkable
when I think of it. But I think that understanding, when you talk about shifts in the United States and its benevolence and so on, that shift may be to a great degree generational. I look at the opportunities that America gave to my parents, who became middle class and were reasonably comfortable. They became bourgeoisified out of conditions of poverty. My mother's parents, my grandfather was a tailor and worked in a sweatshop, never spoke English, and so on. They were poor and so forth, not well educated. And here I am, and my brother, and so on and so forth. So it really has been a tremendous boon. And perhaps it's unsettling that younger generations can't glory or appreciate, is a better word, appreciate that opportunity that was afforded to me. I mean, look, one generation, right, from poverty and
right,
no education to, so that's really quite amazing. And when you talk about liberalism, of course, the American Jewish community has been overwhelmingly liberal. We can bracket the Orthodox for a while. That's changing, and I want to talk to you about that change and how the community is becoming split. But one thing you don't mention that my parents always talked about was their admiration for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was not particularly good to the Jews during World War II, but they were icons of liberal rectitude and so on. And my parents loved Eleanor and Franklin, and they sort of represent the liberal ethos that I think many Jews in America admired and saw themselves as exponents of. Just some thoughts.
Right. And what's that famous Yiddish expression? Diese Welt, jene Welt, Roosevelt, this world, the next world, Roosevelt. That was I'm sure you've heard that before. Yeah, I mean, I had to bracket the New Deal very quickly in that first historical chapter. But what I did point out is that part of the reason for what the phenomenon that you're describing was the charisma of Roosevelt himself and his family, but it also had to do with the fact that American Jews benefited greatly from the New Deal system, and from kind of America's fleeting moment of social democracy. I think about my grandparents who were born in the late 1930s, and their path into the middle class was paved by City College and Hunter College.
Mhm.
And I think that's true for a huge segment of American Jews, certainly those who grew up in the New York area. Um, which is to say that American Jews, and this is a narrative correction I try to make in the book, the one generation story, that's become a story about Jewish individual striving and our mettle and hard work and the sweat of our brow and our bootstraps. But actually, what's missed is that happened in a period where there were public institutions that functioned as engines of upward mobility, and the neoconservatives kind of effaced, I blame them for this, effaced the role of the American of the kind of the New Deal system in the story of American Jewish flourishing.
Right. Well, there's a fourth pillar of Jewish identity in America, which of course you do mention, but to be frank, I would give it some more weight than you do, and that is the validation and the resurrection and the central role given to the Holocaust in terms of
Holocaust.
Jewish identity. And I mean, there was really a campaign in America to give the Holocaust a great deal of prominence. When you think of the Holocaust Museum and other museums, New Jersey factored years ago a mandatory Holocaust curriculum into its schools. The Holocaust, right, which was, you could argue starts as a Jewish event, has become, in effect, broadened to seep into American culture and so on and so forth. But of course, the last of the Holocaust victims, survivors, will pass from the scene, and the Holocaust will move from, history into experience into memory. And, the point has been made to me that there's something strange about building one's identity on victimization, that there's nothing religious about that. There's nothing, in effect, that is uplifting about that. It's sort of an inversion of what you might, in effect, look for. And of course, the Holocaust will fade into significance as indeed it recedes into the past. I'm wondering if you can talk about your view of the Holocaust as being what I would construe as a pillar of modern 20th century Jewish identity.
Sure. I mean, I refer to the Holocaust as kind of the mortar that holds the pillars together in the book, in the sense that America's exceptional goodness appears all the more stark against the backdrop of the Holocaust. Likewise, Israel and Zionism appear all the more necessary against the backdrop of the Holocaust. And also American Jews' attachment to liberalism, the open society, is strengthened by a kind of fear of authoritarianism, clericalism that people kind of intuit from the Holocaust. I mean, my reason for, in retrospect, I should have included more about the Holocaust, but in some sense, it can, as an event, it can kind of become all encompassing. And I wanted to find a way not to only write about that, because so much of American Jewish identity focuses on that. And I agree with you that I think it may have been a pedagogical, strategic error to have made the Holocaust itself a basis for Jewish identity when there's so little to affirm in the memory of the destruction of the Jews. And other than feeling, aggrieved and sad about the event, it doesn't necessarily tell you any one thing to do or what it means in the present. I mean, there is an interesting argument happening right now among different segments of the Jewish community about what the moral lesson of the Holocaust is, which is to say, there are those who say the lesson of the Holocaust is never again that should happen to us, the Jews, and proceed accordingly. And then there's the never again should this happen to anyone, and proceed accordingly. And so to that extent, I think the debate about Holocaust memory remains very live in American Jewish life, but it doesn't allow for the kind of, to use the sociological term, a kind of thick identity that, you can give affirmative reasons for continuing to be Jewish, certainly not, necessarily to future generations. I mean, there was an attempt to do this by, say, the theologian, famously Emil Fackenheim, who coined this term, the 614th mitzvah, about not giving Hitler posthumous victories, and that really became a polemic against intermarriage. That project has failed, and intermarriage is another subject I did not deal with directly in the book, but it's clear that where the organized community plunged its energies in that realm did not really prove to be did not achieve what the authors of those programs hoped they would.
Yes, no, that's true. I want to get back to Zionism and American Jewish identity. Can you focus on the after effects of the 1967 war and what seemed to be the flourishing of the Orthodox Jewish community and the Baal Teshuvah phenomenon and so forth, and has also, I think, occasioned the emergence of a more robust conservative political orientation among segments of the Jewish community. What was the effect of 67 war on American Jewish life?
I mean, it's funny because you asked me this question because I'm begun to already engage in some historical revisionism of my own work, and I think that I probably overstated the emphasis of 67 as a turning point in the conservatizing of American Jewish politics. But the effect of the 67 war was, I mean, part of the reason why the 67 war was so momentous was because what we call Holocaust consciousness had begun to become more pronounced in American Jewish life, and people were afraid that Israel might be destroyed. And so when Israel wins the war and wins so quickly, there's a kind of launch into a jingoistic sort of nationalist pride. And this is happening at the same time as lots of other important things are happening in American life. And the Vietnam War is happening and the Black Power movement begins. There's a massive reconception of identity and group identity in American life. And so just as that's happening in America, what is the war happens. And the result is that American Jews, both at the kind of individual rank and file level, let's say, and also at the organizational level, adopt a much more stridently particularist politics. It also spurs a religious revival that really picks up, to my mind, after the countercultural energies of the 60s have kind of worn themselves out. And this is true, this happens also with like the birth of New Age and lots of the cultic experimentation. Mm-hmm. And I don't, so from a sociological standpoint, the kind of the return to fundamentalism on the part of certain American Jews, I think, is of a piece of that spiritual searching period in American Jewish life. I mean, the people who return to tradition the Baalei Tshuva are never the majority of American Jews, but many people experience a return in some sense to religion, not necessarily only to Orthodoxy. This also produced a pretty robust literature, books like Paul Cowan's Orphan in History, for instance, yes, of a kind of secular people finding their religious roots in forms of traditional Jewish observance. And what's most important about this development is that the people who become leaders of the American Jewish community during this period are the products of this kind of what Irving Howe, the editor of Dissent, calls the inward turn, that a kind of more civic universal form of Jewish politics gets supplanted by this more particularist one. And it's people who are come to political power in the 70s and 80s, who basically run the American Jewish organizational world, yes, until very recently. So, I mean, the fight to free Soviet Jewry is also part of this, whereas we like, on the left and among liberals, we celebrate American Jewish participation in the civil rights movement, but actually the Jewish civil rights movement in terms of particular interest was the Soviet Jewry movement. And the people who came out of that movement, like I said, end up running the organizations until the 2000s. David Harris was a Soviet Jewry activist, runs the American Jewish Committee. Malcolm Heinlein runs the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. Abe Foxman is kind of sui generis, but he is also, in a sense, kind of of this moment. And so, you know, I joked when I was writing the book that this book is really about the importance of the 70s as a decade. Like, we live in the world the 70s made, but all of this gets, even if the events happened in the late 60s, they get processed, let's say, through the 70s and into the early 80s.
Yeah, let's, if we could develop a little bit more. You mentioned in passing leaders, so-called leaders of the American Jewish community, whom, as you point out, are essentially self-appointed. And I think it's an irony, and from my progressive point of view, an unfortunate irony, that the basically identified leaders of the American Jewish community who would contend that they speak for Jewish interests do not represent the cohort of the constituencies whom they claim to represent. I mean, the American Jewish community still remains, if you look at the last election and voting patterns, still remains overwhelmingly liberal. And yet, in effect, the leaders of the major Jewish organizations, I think of AIPAC as being the most prominent, but also the Zionist Organization of America, the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and others, and even B'nai B'rith, in effect, have a very conservative perspective and so forth in their single-minded support of Israel that brooks absolutely no dissent or conversation, which I find from a liberal point of view to be anathema, if not disgusting, that one simply can't talk about this without being anathematized and marginalized. Isn't it? Can you say a little bit more about this split that the major leaders and lobbyists for Jewish interests do not represent the cohorts that they claim to represent?
Yeah, I mean, I think of what you could call the crisis of representation isn't unique to American Jewish life, but it is perhaps particularly acute. I mean, the journalist J.J. Goldberg in the 90s wrote this fantastic book called Jewish Power, and he has a line that I quote in my book, that the vast majority of Americans don't even know the leaders of the names of the leaders of the organizations who speak on their behalf in Washington, D.C. And in some sense, that's also because organizationally, American Jewish politics basically functions as an oligarchy where donors set the agenda. I mean, there's no democratic elected assembly of American Jews. And, you know, among left-leaning and liberal Jews who also strongly identify communally as Jews, this has always been a source of consternation, because part of the problem is that people who devote their lives to Jewish organizations tend not to be liberals and progressives. And so those people are overrepresented in the leadership of American Jewish organizations, making progressives and liberals the minority within the communal organizations, even if they're the overwhelming majority outside of them. You know, I often joke with people, like, if you only live inside the world of like synagogues, federations, organizations, you'd say something like, yeah, American Jewish voters are basically split like 50-50 Harris-Trump in the last election. You wouldn't know that 80% of American Jews voted for Kamala Harris and 20% of American Jews voted for Donald Trump. That gives you a sense of the disconnect. And it is a really, I think, actually, because of the way polarization works, if and before the source of this was the one issue and is a fight over Israel, it's become a larger, you know, division over a wider set of values, as Israel has become slotted into, or as ardent, uncritical support for Israel has become slotted into a wider right-wing worldview. It's also, you know, this has posed a particular challenge for progressive Jews who, yes, you know, resent being spoken for by these right-wing organizational leaders.
Well, there are many forms of personal alienation in being an American Jew. On the progressive end, you know, the spectrum, who has doubts, in fact, about the central theological issues around which Judaism as a religion also pivots. But that's a whole other discussion. You do mention, you spend a few pages talking about the phenomenon, I remember it, of Jewish survivalism being a major cause. And as I recall, and maybe I'm wrong about this, a major impetus for the Jewish survivalist commitment was the meteoric and explosive rise in intermarriage. My orthodoxy taught me that it's absolutely forbidden to marry out. One declares one's children dead if they do marry a non-Jew. When I was a kid growing up in the 1950s, I think the percentage, Joshua, of Jews marrying out was maybe no more than 8%. If one brackets again the Orthodox community, I think today it's closer to 70%. This is a major change, and we have to argue that despite efforts to bring in the non-Jewish partner into the world and to raise children who come from mixed marriages as Jews, one has to argue in the long range that this reflects a thinning of the Jewish community. And as I recall, maybe I'm mistaken, the Jewish survivalist movement to a great measure was spurred by the shock and so forth of the explosive meteoric shift in Judaism. I mean, my presumption as a child was that Jews simply didn't marry out until they did. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, it's there. It takes a time for the survivalist mentality to develop. Of course, the famous Life magazine cover of The Vanishing American Jew was published in 1964. And then kind of the rates of intermarriage, I don't know what they were. They certainly were below 50%. I'm pretty sure what sparked some of the survivalist, like you said, anxiety, are the surveys that showed that the rates were around 50%. I have a critique of the survivalists in the book, one on political grounds, which is that they abandoned a broader Jewish commitment to the public and to social justice in favor of kind of raw biological reproduction and also particularism. But also my critique is that they missed the point, which is that the reason people weren't marrying Jews was because they didn't think that it was particularly important in the first place. And they set about trying to rectify the marriage habits without trying to rectify really in any meaningful way, like the substance of Jewish community, of belonging, of relating to Jewishness. I mean, this is still the case. I didn't harp on this in the book because so much of Jewish publishing energy is devoted to it, but it is the biggest demographic story of the American Jewish life, that intermarriage that became the norm. So if your children, today, if you marry a Jewish person, you were in the minority of American Jews who are doing so. That's by a large margin, actually. And that's had and is having a tremendous effect on American Jewish politics. I think we don't really know how to place the causal, where to place the causal arrow. I mean, I prefer to think of the problem of intermarriage, so to speak, as the Jewish sociologists frame it, as actually a symptom of a much bigger problem, which is the
right. I want to get to that. I mean, you do the American Jewish community is splintering, cracking, and crumbling, as you put it. And you do suggest various directions that the American Jewish community is taking to try to redress some of that loss and some of that fracturing. But before we get there, I want to basically read from your book where you lay out what you think is the prevailing dynamic that is causing this phenomenon of, again, the fracturing of the Jewish community. And to put it most succinctly, as I understand it, Joshua, it's really the reality of individualism and what I would call hyper-individualism in American life. And I want to read from the book. There are some references at the beginning and some at the end where I think you succinctly and powerfully focus on this phenomenon. I must say, I totally and absolutely agree with you. I think that individualism is something that basically is a splintering American life in general, not only Judaism and more liberal forms of Judaism, but if you look at mainline Protestant churches, and you do mention them, they indeed are hemorrhaging very badly. But this is true for all organizational sectors of American life. I mean, you didn't mention him, but as I was reading your analysis, the name Robert Putnam and
Yes,
Bowling
Bowling Alone
Alone,
is in the background of the book.
how prescient he was, right? In Bowling Alone, his thesis, what was it, maybe 30 years ago, was that people are still bowling as much as they used to, but they don't bowl in leagues anymore. In other words, organizational and institutional life in America is disintegrating with very negative repercussions. Indeed, we're suffering, and it's been slightly redressed in the last few years, suffering from deaths of despair. In the last 10 years, something like 1 million Americans have died of alcoholism and suicide and of various diseases, and loneliness. Being alone seems to be at the heart of this. And I would also argue, it's a little harder to prove, that people alone are more prone to authoritarianism, that it lays the groundwork
Right.
for
That's what
someone like
Hannah Arendt thought.
what?
Hannah Arendt makes that argument.
She does, yeah.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. She does. And it lays the ground for a Donald Trump. So this is a major, highly perilous and lamentable phenomenon in American life. And of course, Judaism sociologically is no different in this regard. And you do write that. I want to read from your book, just so maybe some of our listeners can get a sense of the power of your analysis. There are 3 things I want to read, paragraphs that I've sort of taken from it. And then I want you to comment on this, because I think this is really, as I understand it, and I hope I've gotten it right, that this is the heart of your thesis, your analysis. You say on page 13, but it soon turned out that what worked for liberal America could not work for Judaism. The idea of obligation, that struck me. The idea of obligation, the meaning of mitzvah. And then you call it the core of Jewish life. And I think that phenomenon is central to your understanding of Judaism, and I would assume it's correct. You say the idea of obligation, the meaning of mitzvah, the core of Jewish life, fell out of fashion in a liberal capitalist culture that sacralizes individual self-expression and self-gratification. The logic of the market reduced all aspects of life to fungible values, and religious practice became, like Pilates or yoga, just another consumer good. In a world of infinite choice and limitless growth, the kind of commitment and restraint required to sustain community increasingly appeared as an unjustifiable and unpalatable anachronism. By the late 20th century, American Jews had become such good liberals that they could no longer give themselves compelling reasons for why they should live Jewish lives in terms other than those American liberalism furnished for them. I remember, getting back to myself, going to an Orthodox Hebrew school and trying to be religious as a kid, and come Shabbos, I was conflicted between going to shul and watching TV. Right? Or playing, punch ball with my friends in the schoolyard. And I got to tell you, I've got to admit, TV and punch ball won out over that conflict. Page 256, going towards the end of the book. It's a hefty book. Page 256, you say, for most of Judaism's existence, being Jewish meant recognizing Judaism's binding framework, even if one struggled with, bristled at, or neglected, whether with guilt or relish, its stipulations. That's my sort of Shabbos TV watching conflict.
Exactly.
As a 7-year-old, right? Stipulations. Contemporary American Jewish life, by contrast, appears to rest on a roughly opposite axiom. While most American Jews describe themselves as proud to be Jewish, they also seem to believe that such a declaration exists independent of any set of obligations. That is, it requires no adherence, let alone knowledge of Jewish law. Jewishness today has become more of an identity to be professed than a coherent set of practices. Self-gratification and individual preference have supplanted commandedness and commitment to community. It is this liberal/individualist mentality, not queer inclusion or gender egalitarianism, we'll get to that in a bit, that is responsible for mainline affiliated Judaism's demise. And finally, I want to read a similar sentiment idea. Where is it? Okay. Most of all, you say, I've become convinced of the radical potential of traditional Judaism. Of course, I believe that a life centered on the commandments, on mitzvot, is a good life in and of itself. In our current moment, it is also a profoundly and radically countercultural one. Yes, religion should be, I should say in parentheses, should be countercultural when it's bought off, when it becomes commercialized, okay, when it becomes politically powerful and so on, then indeed it's not doing what it should do. That's my view,
Right.
my
It
point
becomes
of view.
corrupt. It becomes
It becomes
corrupted.
corrupt. Right. Quote, the very being of Judaism consists in its imposing a distinctive regime on the everyday existence of the Jew. Yeshayahu Leibowitz writes, quote, the system, he says, of norms is constitutive of Judaism, end quote. At its core, in other words, Judaism is a religion of limits and obligation, two concepts utterly opposed to the dominant currents of contemporary life. Our liberal capitalist culture celebrates boundless growth, infinite choice, and instant gratification. So it does. Traditional Judaism, by contrast, teaches the merits of long-term commitment, patience and restraint, and commitment with one's, and that contentment, with one's lot. Whereas liberal capitalism glorifies the individual while condemning him to an atomized and isolated existence, traditional Judaism requires that life be lived with and for others in obligated community. That's a beautiful phrase, I think. And then you say liberal capitalist culture sets the pace of life according to the market. Traditional Judaism breaks the market's hold by insisting on the priority of Shabbat and Yom Tov. Yes, I absolutely and thoroughly agree with that analysis. It's individualism and the sort of intoxication with individual choice that has caused the splintering and so forth and the fading of organized Jewish life, but of course, not only Jewish life. I want you to talk about that because I find that analysis spot on and very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think at its most basic level, in addition to the passages you read, that once the individual and choice with that became the central logics and units of Jewish practice, it became very hard to sustain Jewish community. I also think that something very essential to Jewishness got lost when concepts like mitzvah and obligation fell out of favor, which is that to be Jewish has always been to be, in some sense, alienated, outside, countercultural. And American Judaism maybe became a victim of its own successful integration, and that those parts of being Jewish that are inconvenient, or and keeping Shabbat and Yom Tov is very inconvenient in a capitalist life, fell by the wayside. I also think that there was a tacit agreement, say, between the Orthodox world and the non-Orthodox world about the incompatibility of obligation and inclusion. And so in some sense, the liberal denomination said, well, we want to be inclusive, but we can't be obligated to this tradition that's homophobic and chauvinist and patriarchal and all these things. So we'll get rid of the concept of obligation in favor of inclusion. And the Orthodox said, that's right, you can't be inclusive and also be obligated, and threw out the inclusion and kept the obligation. And, of course, there are some groups in the Jewish world today that are trying to find a synthesis between obligation and inclusion. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And I think part of the energy, like the places where Jewish life is most dynamic, I would argue are coming from people who are trying to, make that synthesis. But, in general, like you said, we're not just bowling alone now, we're scrolling alone. I know that's a terrible pun, but the important difference is, at least in bowling alone, you got out of the house. Now people are even more isolated. I mean, I think the result of COVID and I see this when I'm in New York, people live in tall buildings, they order takeout, their recreation is watching Netflix. Like, it's a very grim
and
life.
They're addicted to social media too, which is a whole other discussion.
Exactly, it's a whole other thing. It's very corrosive. It's very corrosive to communal life, and to social life, social life in the sense of life with others and society, as well. I think the hardest, one other part of this story that's kind of a footnote in the book is that for all the talk of political polarization, there aren't a lot of people who are putting forward a way out of this kind of morass. And I think that, for me, that's where the radical power of traditionalism came in. Not necessarily because I am a devout person in my personality. And like, we could talk about theology and negative theology and get into it, but I don't think that's the most important thing. But it seemed to me that if you wanted to build, in some sense, a fence around the important things in life, family, community, obligation, then some kind of practice was necessary to do that. And I found that practice in, kind of return to more traditional religious observance. I think there are other ways to do it, but outside of these things, like I think because we live at the terminus of the great modernist ideologies, social, no, very few people are going and setting up communes. There's certainly no, like, there's not much out there forms of resistance to the liberal capitalist society out there. And so for better or for worse, I think that the tradition has the potential to create that necessary friction.
Yeah, but isn't there a daunting problem, if not contradiction here? When I think of my grandparents again, living in a shtetl in eastern Poland, there was a type of, let's call it organic or organicity to their life. They had no choice. I mean, if somebody had come to my Yiddish-speaking grandparents and said, I'd lay before you the opportunity of becoming a Methodist, a Buddhist, a Seventh-day Adventist, a Mormon, and so forth, or a Jew, choose, that question would have made absolutely no sense to them. I mean, they were in fact intrinsically Jews from, the time of Sinai until the coming of the Mashiach. I mean, it just didn't make any sense. But we live in America where individual choice is basically the fabric, that's the wrong word, but in effect is the ethos totally of society. So what are we to do? I mean, the horse is long out of the barn, right? So anyone who wants to live a traditional life is still making an individual choice to do so. And as long as individual choice is the driving vector that causes the person to be more traditional in their religious practice, it's still a choice. And in some ways, that choice has been infected by the very fact that of individual autonomy and the lack of organicity, right? And so on and so forth. So what are we to do? Now, you do mention, this is sort of a lead-in, you mentioned 4 possible directions for contemporary Judaism, but it doesn't sound, if I read you properly, Joshua, you're not terribly hopeful about these.
No.
There's still a patina of pessimism, a curtain of pessimism that hangs over you. Talk about this intrinsic problem of returning to tradition and taking on obligation. And I certainly agree with you, there can be no individual without community. There can be no freedom without binding obligations and so forth, and without restraint, right? And mitzvot provide that, right? But to choose to be restrained is something different than to be born like my grandparents into a community where those types of restraints were in the atmosphere. They were given, and there was simply no choice because there was no choice.
For sure. I mean, we can get into this with the exception of the contemporary ultra-Orthodoxy or the Haredim, like right. There aren't really people who are born into the kind of organic world of mitzvot that you describe. I mean, I do think that, you mentioned this too, that it's a choice, like the choice to take on the burden, as they say, of the mitzvot is a choice, but it also is a different kind of choice, in that it's a choice for it's a restrictive choice. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, writes a lot about this. That he calls this heteronomy. That from the condition of the removal of certain kinds of freedom, a deeper freedom is achieved. And I think that's a very Jewish idea. It's something that if you open the traditional Passover Haggadah that comes through, I think the comparison to the contemporary is very easy. For instance, in our ordinary lives, we're bombarded with all kinds of commercial advertisements for things, impulses, buy this, eat that. We're slaves to our kind of impulsive desires. But when you take on a framework that says, no, I can't eat that, or I can't do that, then you actually develop a certain kind of freedom to live a life that's not solely dictated by the market, say. So I think that it's a different kind of choice, but you're right that the autonomous individual can't be put back in the bag. We're 3 centuries post Enlightenment. So here we are. When it comes to the future of American Jewish life, it's funny. It is pessimistic, but I think my pessimism has been misunderstood, because sometimes people say like, oh, you're a declensionist and you think American Jewish life is going to disappear. I actually don't think it's going to disappear. I think the more frightening prospect is that it continues this way for a very, very long time. In other words, when you're in a process of decline, there's maybe, you can dispute the psychoanalytic soundness of this idea, but when you're in a period of decline for a long time, there's a certain desire for a cathartic end to it. And I think that in some sense, this is true of like a narrative also. We want there to be an end to this story. We want it to be wrapped up. We want it to be made coherent. But I think the more frightening possibility is that the kind of incoherence and muddling that kind of describes, I think, a lot of American Jewish life could just go on for a century. Maybe it could go on for 2 centuries. There might be no cathartic resolution to the contradictions. This might just be modernity. And so what now? But I mean, there are material reasons also why I think it could go on for a long time. And that has to do with the way that I see the different options for Jewish life in the future. And so in the book, I chart, as you said, these 4 different paths. One is something that I call the dying establishment. And that's basically the existing organizational infrastructure, seminaries, federations. You know, the thing about these organizations is that they're still pretty well funded. They have strategic plans into the next century. They'll outlive everyone who's currently enrolled in them. But they're not organizations with a mass base. They don't have a large, buy-in. Certainly no one really sees them as representative in a meaningful way. But for those who want that kind of Jewish life, that'll be an option for people. Kind of as a reaction to the stultified establishment is something that I call prophetic protest. And this is the kind of the Jewish tendency that sees its Judaism actualized in protest, whether that's protest against the Trump administration or it's protest against immigration detention or protest against Israeli policies and its conduct of the war. It's a kind of Judaism that primarily lives in the streets, but it also, the problem with that this form of Judaism has is not sure where religion goes, like when you're come back from the protest. And that's something that people will have to work out. The third path that I chart is something that I call neo-reform. I don't mean the reform movement, but I mean kind of the logic of the reform movement, which is that to update tradition to whatever the kind of contemporary way of thinking is about people and society. And so if the prophetic protest takes Judaism out of the synagogue and puts it into the street, neo-reform takes politics and puts it into the synagogue. And there's a little bit of a synthesis between these 2 paths, but I think they are different and they're different people. Not everyone who wants to protest Israel wearing a kippah or wants to protest the Trump administration with a tallis wants at the same time to bring that back into the synagogue or even necessarily goes to synagogue. And then the fourth option, and I think this is the option that poses, it constitutes the most substantial alternative to the American Jewish consensus that I've sketched out, is what I call separatist orthodoxy. And this is largely ultra-Orthodoxy or Haredi Judaism, but it's not only Haredi Judaism. There's streams of what we would call centrist modern Orthodoxy that probably have become more centrist, more separatist in their impulses as time has gone on. And it's an attempt to basically recreate the organic world of Yiddishkeit and mitzvot that you described. I mean, I think and just to give a sense of the disconnect, the largest yeshiva arguably in the world, maybe second largest, is in the town of Lakewood, New Jersey. Yes. Most American Jews have never heard of it or never been there. Right. So, yeah. I think separatist orthodoxy, for those who want it, will be among them maybe the most vibrant alternatives, if that what you want is kind of the total Jewish experience. Of course, that means buying into a lot of things. I think if you're a progressive person, it's almost impossible to live that kind of life. If it's a very restrictive way of living, and none of these paths are ever going to be, to use the word, like hegemonic in the way that mid-century Jewishness was. Right. We're never going back to the old consensus. And that's okay.
Well, I don't know. I mean, given my own personal identity is what you might call a progressive social justice Jew, which is sometimes a term used with disparagement, but and so on. That's been my identity. And to find that fading from the scene and being overtaken by a more, let's use the term inaccurately, a more fundamentalist form of Judaism, it's not something as a progressive I can welcome or entertain or at all identify with. But that's a whole other discussion. I just want to mention one thing that seems like an omission in your book when you talk about the future of Judaism and its promise. In fact, you don't spend much time talking about modern Orthodoxy. You do have a chapter on Hasidism, and you mentioned that your wife comes from that world, and so on and so forth. And you talk about Lakewood, but you don't talk about modern Orthodoxy, which seems to be one branch of Judaism that indeed is flourishing. I worked for 46 years in Teaneck, New Jersey, where I am at this very moment. I think there are something like 15 Orthodox synagogues in Teaneck, maybe more, 15 that we might know about. My childhood neighborhood in Queens, as I mentioned, Forest Hills. I went to the Queens Jewish Center, which was the first of modern Orthodox institutions back in the 50s. You now go back to 108th Street in Forest Hills, and there are about a dozen Orthodox institutions that radiate from there. And there are other centers of modern Orthodoxy in the New York area and around the country, I think in Cleveland, in Baltimore, and so on and so forth. Isn't that a form of Judaism that is indeed growing? It's not growing in numbers hugely, but is in effect increasingly more robust. Isn't that one of the few promising directions for American Judaism to take? You seem not to discuss that in the book, Joshua, unless I missed something.
No, this has turned out to be one of the more significant omissions of the book. I mean, there are reasons for it, which we can get into.
Okay.
I mean, I think that modern Orthodoxy is both the beneficiary and the victim of what I would call like a certain paradox of salience, which is that if you were involved in Jewish life, the modern Orthodox appear to be a very significant portion of American Jews. But when you look at surveys of American Jews, the modern Orthodox are the smallest portion of American Jews. In fact, of the 10% of Jews who are Orthodox, the modern Orthodox are not even half. The majority of Orthodox Jews are ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic or non-Hasidic Haredi Jews. But it is true that the modern Orthodox have become, in some sense, the vanguard of organizational Jewish life. They participate in Jewish institutions at much higher rates than all of the other liberal denominations. And I think in the end, I decided not to include modern Orthodoxy because, and for this reason, they actually embody a recommitment to the pillars that I think have crumbled for the rest of American Judaism. In other words, modern Orthodoxy is very patriotic. It's very Americanist. And even as like a life devoted to mitzvot that they have, which is admirable. And I haven't, and part of the reason is also personal, which is I basically make my community, my life like on the margins of progressive modern Orthodoxy. And so it felt boosterish to have included some of that, or maybe inside base. I mean, there was going to be a chapter about religious feminism, and that would have dealt with some of the debates between modern Orthodoxy and non-Orthodox forms of religious feminism. But that wasn't included because it would have required the reader to go sit through too many halachic digressions, and already the book was pushing it for the average reader in terms of Jewish content. But to go back to what I was saying before, because of of course, modern Orthodoxy is also among them, like probably the most Zionist, the most right-wing Zionist in terms of its politics. And so I don't think it really presents an alternative to the pillars of the consensus as much as an intensification of them. And for that reason, you find so many modern Orthodox Jews leading organizational life. They might be like, they might be the last true believers in this synthesis. And it would have been interesting to write that. Also, I I regret that they didn't get included in that way. But these were the reasons that were at the back of mind when I was working on the book.
Right. Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to begin to wind this down and bring this to a close. As I said, I could sit here for hours talking about with
Likewise.
you about this all fascinating stuff that I'm basically extremely vibrantly interested in. But there are a few questions I want to move beyond the book, if I may, and so forth, that I really have to ask, given the moment and so on. What is your take on contemporary anti-Semitism in America? And I'm thinking what most concerns me, of course, is progressive anti-Semitism. I think some of it can be understood. Anti-Semitism now can be understood as a subset of white nationalism and white supremacy, and the resurgence of hate in America by hate groups. But there's also progressive anti-Semitism, which causes me as a progressive the greatest deal of angst, and so on and so forth. And to the extent to which it goes, has alienated me from sectors of the progressive movement. I'm wondering if you can talk about the recrudescence of anti-Semitism in our time.
Yeah. So, one thing about the book is that I wrote the manuscript right before October 7th and was about to submit it, and ended up rewriting a substantial portion of it. One of the chapters was basically not in the book, and I added it over time to work on. And another part of the book that was added was a more head-on treatment of anti-Semitism in the progressive activist world. I certainly underestimated its prevalence and have been taken aback likewise by the virulence of anti-Semitism in some quarters of, let's say, like the anti-imperialist left, where that's self-described. I mean, I think that in historical perspective, this isn't so new. Famously, the German social democrat August Bebel called it the socialism of fools, anti-Semitism, the socialism of fools. I think that one way to look at anti-Semitism is that it is often a fantasy or a conspiracy of exorbitant Jewish power, and that the Jew becomes the face of systems of power. So rather than, say, getting mad about capitalism causing gentrification, the Jewish landlord becomes the symbol. Or rather than being frustrated by American global dominance, it becomes a story about Jewish dominance of American dictating policy. And there was a quote from a left-wing leader early after the October 7th attacks and then the start of Israel's war on Gaza, who said something like, "The day that Israel is destroyed will be the greatest victory in the fight against capitalism and global capitalism and imperialism," which is a crazy thing to say, but it's become a kind of common way of talking about things. And that's because Israel, and by virtue of its Jewishness, is imagined as kind of the locus of power. I mean, I think one other part of this that I'm still working on theorizing is the way that American racial politics have come to play a role in this. And so there is a reason why, say, people have kind of created this chain of terms of Zionist white supremacy, and the insistence of white Israelis and Israel as a white racist state. And I think that has to do also with a kind of basic denial in some sense of Jewish collectivity. In other words, if Jews are just other white people, then forms of Jewish collective organization are illegitimate and problematic, the way that a white nationalist organization would be. And that's kind of the function of the labeling there. Of course, Jews are also white people in America, but Jewishness as a collective existence is not merely a mask for whiteness, but because of American racial politics, this is how things have been framed. So I think that's my understanding of why these phrases and this rhetoric has perked up in the particular kind of old-fashioned way that it has. What's crazy is if you go back to 1972 and you look at some of the rhetoric that was kind of on the Maoist left in the United States, it's not so different, actually. I mean, certain things are changed, but this is maybe this has been going on for a long time.
Okay. Yeah, I want to get to a final question, I guess, which is personal to me, but certainly I suspect can be nothing other than very personal to you. I'm having this conversation with you. I'm in Teaneck, New Jersey, and at the moment you're in Tel Aviv, Israel. You've moved to Israel. You mentioned in your book that you had been to Israel and lived in Israel in younger years quite a few times. Let me just ask briefly, have you made Aliyah to Israel? Are you planning to stay there? Or are you planning, is this
Um,
another temporary stay and you'll be coming back?
Hard to say at
Okay.
this
Well,
point.
this is a very, unless you enjoy going to war zones and challenging situations in life, it seems to be basically not a particularly opportune time to move to Israel, and to make that choice is psychologically interesting. We won't get into that. I'm more interested, in effect, in the ethics and the ethics of Israel. As part of the series, I recently interviewed Eric Alterman, who wrote, like you, for The Nation for many years, and he wrote a magisterial book entitled We Are Not One, which is in effect a history of 600 pages on American Jewish American Israeli, excuse me, relations through the years. And during the conversation, he had mentioned something which seems to me to be compellingly true, and that is that Israel is now a red state and the American Jewish community is a blue state. Okay. And as a result, he's moved away from his support of Israel. He's putting his Jewish identity and his Jewish commitments in other areas, and so on and so forth. Israel has become a very conservative society. And as a progressive, I am torn. And specifically, when I get to the war on Gaza, where more than 40,000 Gazans have been killed and 200,000 bombs dropped on apartment buildings and so on and so forth, it basically, to be personal about it, is very upsetting, and very upsetting to my sense of being a Jew and my Jewish ethics. There are the ritual mitzvot, which you talk about in terms of binding obligations, but there are also the ethical mitzvot. And I grew up on the presumption that for Jews, life and the preservation of life was the highest value. The Torah suspends itself on Shabbos if indeed a life needs to be saved, and so on and so forth. And I remember discussions with rabbis and debates. Does the preservation of life pertain only to Jewish life, or is it universalized in terms of the life of everyone being cherished? And we can go back between Torah and Talmud and have those debates, but life is a very high value. I went to Israel in February of this year because I wanted to see things on the ground and get a feel for it. And in one sense, I found very admiring that Jewish civil society had come together for mutual support while feeling betrayed by the army and the government. I thought that was very thick and very admirable. On the other hand, Joshua, I have to be honest, I was very disturbed that in my conversations with people who shared common values, including political scientists and people who might otherwise think we're progressive on the left, there was not a single word, not one word of compassion for the destruction of Palestinian life. Not one. As a Jew, I found that very disturbing. I mean, I grew up as a Jew on the notion that if you don't have compassion, what makes you a Jew? And it was totally absent on my trip to Israel. And I've got to tell you, this leaves me very conflicted. As I mentioned to you, much of my interiority is Jewish. My ethics, to a great extent, come from my identity as a Jew. And now I find myself painfully torn by, in effect, Israel's moving to the right, okay, becoming highly conservative, and by the war in Gaza. That's where I stand. Where do you stand? And as a progressive, how do you, and feel free not to answer this if you want, it's a
No, it's
personal
an important
question.
question.
How do you reconcile these issues that are so painful to me? You're a fellow progressive, a fellow Jew, you're there, I'm here, you confront those issues. How are you coping with this? How do you reconcile it, if you can?
I mean, I agree fully with your analysis and read of things. I think where the maybe the difference is that because of my younger life experiences here, also as a journalist, but also in some sense as an activist, it felt like if there's any chance of changing this horrific reality, it might actually be on the ground here rather than from afar. I'm not saying that there's like a great hope that things might change. I mean, there's a Hebrew word that I've been thinking about a lot which is hitabahamut, or to become the becoming beastly and barbarous. And to me, there has become a kind of societal barbarism that's been normalized on the media, and it is a shame, and and horrifying. For me, there is a core group of people here who, are out on the streets once or twice a week protesting this war. And those are my friends and comrades. And I think that their fight is the essential fight. I mean, if to the extent that there is an ethical test of sovereignty, Israel is failing it. It also is, there also is a Jewish tradition that's being threatened by the worship of force in Israel. One way to think about not to get rabbinical, last week's Parsha, we read in the Torah the story of Jacob and Esau, and the description for Jacob is Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Oalim. He's a sitter. He sits in tents. He's gentle. And for a long time, we took pride in Jacobness, but Israel, and you hear this, and then it has become is kind of an Esau state, an Esav in Hebrew state, and it's sanctified the use of force and violence. Because of my understanding of the directionality of Jewish culture, I think that what happens in Israel then carries a carryover effect onto America. And so if you want to combat these developments in Jewish culture in a broad sense, then it's maybe necessary to be on the ground here. But I share your grief and a sense of perturbedness by this reality. I mean, the only saving grace about being here in the political sense is that it in some sense has allowed me to be more of a leftist than I felt I could have been, because there isn't very much left-wing anti-Semitism in Israel. And so I don't have to fight a two-front war. I can concentrate all my energy on the right. I don't want to be fighting with the kooks and the cranks. And there are other kooks and cranks here of other kinds. And so in that sense, it's refreshing. But I think that, I felt a sense of implication and responsibility in what Israel was doing. And it felt like, well, at a certain point, if I'm going to write and talk and argue and all protest about the place over there, then maybe it makes sense to be over there for some time and, see how it goes. But the country is, I don't need to tell you, is in a very dangerous position. It's in addition to, the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and its basically wholesale destruction, is Netanyahu is engineering a kind of Viktor Orban style autocratic takeover. And so, it's funny, in the 1970s, there were all these writings when Menachem Begin first became prime minister, like, what happens if Israel became a fascist state? I think that's closer than ever before to happening. And, from a Jewish perspective, if that would be a tragedy for me, then I have to have some role in preventing it, both from being a fascist state and engage in an aggressive war, seizing territory and destroying people in Gaza, but also because of, the fabric of society here, which, like you said, also has a really positive elements. Like, it is a culture that has social solidarity, like you said, in a civil society in a way that is very different from, say, life in the United States.
Yes.
So that's a personal answer to your personal question.
Well, all power to you. And I hope at the end of the day, you basically emerge victorious in this on the moral front and the political front and so on. As the Chinese say, we're bleeding from 1,000 wounds. And it's really good that you're there to stanch some of those wounds. This has really been an absolutely marvelous discussion. One final question I got to ask you. What lies ahead for you, Joshua?
I'm continuing to work as a journalist, report from on the ground here. I'm working on my PhD dissertation, and hopefully doing kind of more writing and convening and talking to people and trying to, one of the roles that I've had that I've understood my own work to play is translating Israel's very beleaguered progressive camp into English. And, I think Israel and American Jewry have suffered from the collapse of real bridges between American and American Jewish progressives and Israeli progressives. And I think that if there are ways to build that, I think it'll strengthen both sides of the people camps on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, that's kind of one broader goal that I have. I mean, there's only so much we can do. We are in deeply bad times. You know, the forces of reaction are victorious across the world, whether it's Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, probably Marine Le Pen in France as well, barring some kind of, you know, it's become a lot harder to make a case for progressive values, equality. And so, you know, we might be in for a darker, part of my dispositional pessimism means like, oh, things are bad now, but they could get really much worse. But that's, but you know,
well,
have to fight the fight.
We know what we have to do, whatever the future has in store for us. Dr.
Exactly.
Leifer, I want to thank you so very, very much for this absolutely marvelous conversation. I wish you all your success with your book. Hopefully you will soon achieve your PhD. The motto, having gone through that hazing, is make sure you do your second best on your dissertation. Don't, you know, don't beat yourself up too much. And you know what? When you come back here, and I assume you will, at least to visit or to stay, let's get together. I'd love to sit down and extend this conversation in person with you.
Likewise.
Joshua Leifer, thank you so very, very much, and we wish you the best. Take care now.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.